offered this as an online class once before. And I recently gave this presentation to a group of 40 eighth graders from the High Plains School, which is a 10-minute walk from the environmental center. The kids then took this information and made posters that are being exhibited here at the environmental center. So if you live nearby, you can come by and see the 20 posters that the students produced. And we were really excited that advance my slide. That it was a front page story in the Reporter Herald yesterday. So I mean, I think this is really cool for the students, because as eighth graders, it just underscores that they have a voice, and this is going to impact their future. And if they do something like this to draw attention to a conservation issue, they just checking my battery, making sure this is charging. That they can actually bring attention to the issue. So that was a really cool and effective program. So we'll begin with the big picture. The snowfall in the Rockies supplies 80% of our state's water supply here in Colorado, as well as providing water for over 40 million people in 7 Western states. And we've been hearing these dire stories about the crisis in the watershed of the Colorado River, and that in some places Lake Mead and other lakes are at a historic low. If they go any lower, they can become a dead pool where no water can flow out of them. And yet this has not crept up on us. It's like people have known about this for a long time. We've anticipated for a long time, but we've done very little about it. And we're going to talk about the water in our state, where it comes from, where it goes, and how the water is used. The average person in Colorado uses 150 gallons of water per day. 60% of residential water consumption, or 90 gallons of water per person per day, goes to landscaping. And we talk about a water crisis, but if you look around this summer, you'll see water spewing all over the place. It's like we can't get rid of it fast enough. And I did an interview recently on KGNU radio in Boulder Public Radio, and I talked about this. And well, one of the things I think about it is many people who have moved to Colorado are of European heritage. Somewhere deep in our mind, there's this verdant fields and green meadows, and this is just how we imagine or believe the world should look. Colorado is already beautiful, didn't need to be improved or changed, but we're bringing that concept with us to this land. And this may work in Massachusetts and New Jersey, but it doesn't really work here in Colorado. We don't have the water to support this, and a different kind of landscaping is more appropriate here. And so we're going to be exploring what that type of landscaping is. Colorado's population grew from 543,000 people in 1900 to 5.7 million in 2019. Over the next 20 years, Colorado's population is expected to grow by roughly 30%, increasing to 7.52 million people by 2040. So we may be getting less water because of climate change, and we're using more water than people have historically in this area. And the population's growing. So there's kind of a triple whammy there where all these things are stacking up. even if, because of climate change, the water didn't diminish, we're still going to be putting 30% more demand on this shrinking resource unless we change how we use the water. It's also worth mentioning that 50% of the water use in the Colorado River Basin is related to raising cattle. And it's not that cows are drinking all this water, but if you look at the list of crops that we grow in Colorado and in the Colorado River Basin, it's alfalfa and feed corn and other crops that are used to fatten cattle in feedlots. So one could argue that the most sustainable food we could grow in a grassland, an arid grassland like we have here in the West, is animals. And people who live traditionally in Mongolia and here in North America, they primarily ate grazing animals in these grasslands. But when you take those cattle, you move them to a feedlot and you pump them full of all these crops that are grown, that has a very different impact on the land. And so when we look at how water is allocated in the state, 89% of the water still goes to agriculture. So primarily that's where it's going. But 50% of our water in Colorado is specifically going to raising cattle. And 25% of our water nationwide is going to beef production. So that is something that would be worth looking at. There are places in the world where they have captured and purified municipal water. So when we wash dishes, when we wash clothes, when we flush the toilet, all of that water can be captured, purified, and recycled. And in places where they don't have sufficient water, that's being done already. Another thing that is being looked at worldwide is developing crops that are more drought resistant, and that's already happening. Kind of covering up my own slide here, unfortunately, but when we talk about large amounts of water, we speak in terms of acre feet. And it's because when we start counting up gallons of water, we get to an enormous number rather quickly. So an acre foot is 325,851 gallons. And this chart is about Colorado's water stream flows and how they're used. There is an agreement with the federal government that Colorado can only keep 40% of the stream flows within the state. And I think that was put into place when President Roosevelt signed a bill that created the Big Thompson Water Project, and millions of dollars were pumped into this project. And as part of that agreement, Colorado needs to agree to share the water in the Colorado River. The total stream flows in the state are 13,700,000 acre feet. 38% of that stays within the state, 62% leaves the state. The amount exiting the state is 8,400,000 acre feet. And the amount consumed within the state is 5,300,000 acre feet. This is how that water is allocated within the state. Of that 5,300,000 acre feet, 89% goes to agriculture. 7% goes to our municipal water supply. So what's in the fire hydrant and our irrigation systems and what we cook and drink and flush toilets and use in our homes is 7% of the water within the state. And 4% goes to industrial uses of various kinds. So 7%, we could look at that and say like, well, that's a tiny number. Why does that matter? Or can we, does conservation of that 7% really make a big impact overall? Well, if you multiply that 7% of 5,300,000 times 325,851, we are talking about trillions of gallons of water. So yes, it does make a difference. Another thing I think that's worth mentioning is when we look at the 89% that's going to agriculture, it's a little bit hard to say what is really being diverted from stream flows there, because water will be diverted from rivers into irrigation canals. It will flood fields. It will recharge the groundwater, and some of it will flow back into the watershed. So it's a little bit hard to say exactly, what is actually being lost there in terms of the stream flows. So it's important to look at the region where we live. And as I mentioned before, New York and Boston and the Pacific Northwest, I mean, these are places that get as an inch of rain a week or more. Here we get 12 to 15 inches of precipitation a year. And the last 2 years, 2021 and 22, were considered the driest period in 1,100 years. So here in Loveland, we got virtually no precipitation from July of 2021 until June of 2022. I mean, it was literally bone dry here, and in an already dry region, and that has big impacts. But we don't have the rainfall. I mean, I was a landscaper in Maine for 10 years, and I never saw an irrigation system until moving to the West in the mid 1990s. But we just don't have the kind of climate that supports green meadows and lawns and similar to European gardens. One of the things that is exacerbating the water use is climate change. And as temperatures rise, it can lead to fewer and more intense precipitation events. And we've heard this a few years ago. A storm parked over Houston, Texas, and dropped like 20 inches of rain. So storms are acting differently. The other thing is the transpiration rate. On the bottom of the leaves of plants, there are these little organs called stomata that will breathe out, then transpire the moisture. So plants are pulling moisture up out of the ground, and the stomata are releasing moisture into the atmosphere. And the more the heat rises, the more transpiration will occur, and so more water. Needs more water to keep the plants going. So as temperatures get hotter, we use more water to support plants. So using drought-tolerant native plants won't solve all of our water supply problems, but it's a great place to start. And this photograph is my neighbor in Fort Collins. And I have taken a lot of photographs of this garden, and they've showed up in a lot of places. I just think this is a great example of what our gardens and our landscapes around our homes can and should look like. This is a landscape that is watered very, very little. There's pollinator forage here. It's beautiful. It's appropriate for our region. And I just think the reason that we're putting in miles and miles of turf grass is just a profound lack of imagination. We don't know what's possible, and therefore we do something that is relatively boring and bland. And we need more good examples like this. Utilizing native plants helps to restore wildlife habitat within the landscapes that we design and build. And if you have heard of Doug Tallamy, who wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, and a second volume called Nature's Best Hope. He talks about how we have 40 million acres of turf grass in the United States. We use 800 million gallons of gasoline to mow lawns every year. Homeowners use more herbicide, pesticide, and fertilizer per square foot on lawns than is used on any other crop. And there's very little biodiversity in a turf grass lawn, particularly that's so heavily impacted by chemicals. And it's having a huge impact on our insect population. And the lack of insects is having an enormous impact on our bird population. So it really makes a difference. Doug Tallamy talks about something that he calls, I think, the homegrown state park. And the idea is we take half of that 40 million acres of turf grass and turn it into restored native plant landscapes. And if we did that 20 million acres would be bigger than our 10 largest national parks combined. So this really is a grassroots form of activism, quite literally. And in a way that we can have immediate impact on our insect populations. And just as an example, our friend Paul Oppler, who recently died, but he was an entomologist at CSU, and he did a study here at High Plains Environmental Center on our native plants garden. Well, we started building the garden in 2015, and in 2021 and 2022, he counted bees in the garden and identified over 100 species of native bees in this garden. So it's just an example that if you build it, they will come. And I've always said that native plants support habitat, but we never really had the specific associations of what bee species were going to specific plants and how many species we had. So it's really cool to have that data. Here's an example. This is the garden that study was done in. The lower picture is in August, probably early August, and the upper picture is in October. And it's an example of how the garden is beautiful. There's colors there. It's interesting. And this is a garden that is never, ever watered. It was started in 2015. We ran drip irrigation to the shrubs just to get them established. And then we shut off the water, and it's never been watered in 6 years. The only thing we ever water are new plants that we put in. We just hand water for the first season. And just an example of what a regionally adapted landscape can be like. And this garden is intended. Does someone have their microphone on? Please turn it off. Could someone turn off? We're getting some interruption here. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about hydrological zones. This is a photograph that I took at Laurie State Park. And a great time to see this is in the fall, when the shrubs are the foliage is turning different colors, or in the spring, when you see the different kinds of flowers that are coming out on shrubs. But what I see when I look at this photograph, in the foreground, that bright red color is Prunus americana, the American plum. Behind that, there's a kind of a burnt orange color, and that is Rus trilobata, the three-leaf sumac. A little bit further up on the slope, I see rabbit brush and mountain mahogany. And then up in the rocks, you can see there's Rocky Mountain juniper and ponderosa pine. And plants will naturally arrange themselves in the landscape based on the existing hydrology. And when you become familiar with this concept, you can scan your eye across the landscape and tell exactly what the soil moisture is in different contours of the landscaping. And this concept can be reduced to any scale. And so restoration ecologists will do restoration projects with this idea of hydrological zones, like where would you find chokecherries and plums and the riparian shrubs, and where would you find the upland shrubs, and everything that I'm going to talk about in this class beyond this slide is going to follow this concept of hydrological zones and how this actually exists in the tiniest home yard or any kind of landscape. I often use the phrase native plants, and we hear people talking about native plants all the time. But what are native plants really? If we say native to the state of Colorado, well, my cursor here is in this area where it says 2025. As you can see, Colorado has 6 different ecological zones. And this map is made from the Environmental Protection Agency. It's called OMERNIP's map of ecoregions. And basically looks at the United States in terms of soil type and climate and rainfall and so on, and breaks it down into zones. You can see that there is no state that's entirely within one zone, and there's no zone that's entirely within one state. So to say Colorado native plants is kind of arbitrary. That's just a political designation. It doesn't really mean anything about the ecology. And we have so many zones because we have dramatic changes in our elevation here. And for that reason, we have more zones than many other states. But most people in Colorado live along the Front Range. And the largest population centers are on the Front Range, which is basically the western edge of the Great Plains and an area called the shortgrass prairie or the High Plains. And so if you live in Fort Collins, Loveland, Denver, you are on the edge of the western edge of the shortgrass prairie. And in many ways, your garden has more to do with western South Dakota and western Nebraska, western Kansas, and the Oklahoma Panhandle and eastern New Mexico and eastern Wyoming than it has to do with mountain towns like Vail and Aspen. And so if we're looking at native plants, we should be looking at our ecoregion rather than our state. So here's an example of a garden that we did at High Plains Environmental Center. And it's the first time that I really used this concept of doing a landscape design that's driven by the idea of ecological zones. And the first, what we wanted to do is unpack this concept of High Plains Environmental Center and BHA, a landscape architecture firm, and McWhinney, the developer in Centerra, and Arc Ecological Services created a document called the Centerra Natural Area and Stormwater Guidelines. And it won an award from the American Society of Landscape Architects. It looks at stormwater ponds with the potential of ecological restoration and describes different zones that might exist within a stormwater pond. But we didn't feel like that concept was immediately accessible to stormwater engineers. And so we created a pond that really highlighted this notion of different hydrological zones. And the first thing that I laid out a pattern on the ground that looks like the braided landform that you would see looking down on the South Platte River. And we dug down in that pattern. On the left there, you can see what it looked like the next year after it filled up with water. And you have like these like channels and islands, and it's sort of cool looking in itself. But that created zones that included aquatic, so emergent aquatic plants actually growing out of the water, and wetland, the plants that grow on the edge of that, sub-irrigated, places where there's water underneath, but they're not really wet on the surface, and upland. And the bottom two photographs show the aquatic zone with the emergent plants there. There's hardstem bulrush growing right out of the water. And then the upland zone that got created. And so this, for me, is where the notion of landscape design and ecological restoration really became woven into one and the same thing. And everything that we did at High Plains Environmental Center after this really followed this pattern. So here's an example of how this can be reduced to the smallest possible terms. How do you grow a plant like Verbena hastata or blue vervain, which is basically a native wetland plant? How do you grow that in a landscape that is completely unirrigated? And the answer is you put it at the bottom of the rain chain that's concentrating all of the water off of your roof. And everybody has a roof and gutters. We act like we're terrified of rainwater in Colorado, even though we are a really a very dry part of the country. People are worried because we have expansive soils, and clay can expand and crack our concrete and so on. But where the gutters are, that can flow out into your landscape. And this is called passive rainwater harvesting. But it can be as small as just planting a plant like this that needs a lot of water in the wettest part of your garden. I mean, I think that's the simplest definition. So even the smallest house has multiple microclimates. And we're going to talk about those microclimates and where different plants will go in the landscape. This is the front of the High Plains Environmental Center. And what we have in front of our building is a bioswale. All of the water that comes off of our parking lot flows into basically a ditch that's in front of our building. We created a little bridge that goes over this ditch, and there are different micro pools that will fill up with water. And it doesn't hold the water very long. It really just slows down the turbulence of the water, and it allows it to infiltrate a little bit. And you can see on the low-lying part of this photograph, you see the swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, and right in the center, there's Panicum virgatum, the switchgrass, and some goldenrods there in the background. These are plants that like to be in the moist, low-lying areas. But up on the edges, we see Penstemon palmeri and rabbit brush on the other side. Fern bush is also in this garden, and those are in the higher and drier areas. So knowing the water requirements of the plants and knowing where to put them is an essential part of how to design a landscape that doesn't need any water, because plants are located in communities in the places that have the appropriate soil moisture. So I'm going to begin. Imagine again, we're thinking in terms of an ecological restoration, and we're going to start in the the lowest, wettest area. So these are riparian shrubs. If you are hiking in Colorado and you're down near a creek, a river, the bottom of a valley, or by a pond, it's likely that you will see these plants growing together in a community, and often in the company of cottonwood trees. So that I have there's a mistake here. This chokecherry is Prunus americana. So there's a wrong name, but the chokecherry is one that you see there. Red twig dogwood, the Cornus sericea, western snowberry, Symphoricarpus occidentalis, and golden currant, the Ribes aureum. And these are all good shrubs for landscaping. And where they typically grow are in these areas with moist soils. I want to point out also that where you find these plants growing, they're growing in colonies or thickets, and landscapers like to make these individual trees. But when we have done restorations in open space and HOAs and so on, you can see on the right, we have tried to replicate what we see in nature, which is on the left. And that is, you get a higher story of the cottonwood trees, and then an understory of the chokecherries, and then lower plants that might include the woods rose or the snowberry, and you get this multi-tiered effect. And that is really beneficial for wildlife. And they say that a study has been done about the cottonwood trees, how they're not actually competing for moisture with the shrubs, but might actually be the hydraulic action of the cottonwood trees pulling up water is benefiting the shrubs. And this is a really beneficial arrangement for birds, and birds might have something to do with why this is constructed this way in nature, because the birds will eat the fruits of these plants, and they sit up in the cottonwood trees, their droppings will fall down, and then the trees act like a nursery for the shrubs. And so we see this occurring in nature, and we have tried to replicate this in our landscape designs. One plant that does not all of this pattern is Prunus americana, the American plum, which almost always grows just to itself, not with other shrubs, in sunny open areas. And they say that bees may have something to do with how this has evolved, because this plant is one of the earliest blooming plants. We will probably see it in our area here blooming within the next week. It has an overwhelming grape juice kind of fragrance to it. And bees are attracted to the fragrance, and bees have selected the earliest blooming ones for pollination, because bees come out of hibernation and dormancy and are looking for anything in bloom, and they will come to this plant first. And that is possibly a reason that this has evolved to always growing in open sunny areas. Also, some bees require warmth and sunlight for to be active in their pollination. Here are other plants that you would see in that moist soil: the bee balm, Monarda fistuosa, tulip gentian, which grows here on the edge of our lake here at High Plains Environmental Center. We have a really large, naturally occurring patch of this plant, but it really grows right down on the edge of the lake in a kind of a moist, saturated soil. Asclepias incarnata. There are many good milkweeds for landscaping. I consider this one of the best because it behaves like we expect landscape plants to. And by that, I mean it doesn't spread around or expand the way the common milk or the showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa. And also in urban and suburban landscapes, we tend to be in places where the soil is relatively wet. We have all the displaced moisture from our rooftops and so on. And if they're adjacent to lawns, it's often an issue that the soil may be too wet for a lot of other native plants. When we talk about liatris, people often talk about Liatris punctata as being the native one in Colorado. This one also can be found, and ironically, it's called the Rocky Mountain blazing star. This is found in moist areas in northern Colorado, but this plant, more than any other one that I've seen, is an incredible butterfly magnet, and particularly for the monarch butterfly. It's ridiculous how many butterflies will find this plant. So really great for that reason. And as I mentioned, this is the short grass prairie, but in low-lying areas, we do have areas of tall grass prairie. And the tall grass prairie is basically the eastern portion of the Great Plains, Illinois, Minnesota. These are places that where it's a prairie, but they have more moisture. That's where, as this was described, that grasses that were chest high to a horse. And that occurs in Colorado in low-lying areas with sufficient moisture. And some of these grasses are fantastic grasses for landscaping and actually quite popular. And those grasses include the big blue stem grass, which is also sometimes called turkey foot, Andropogon gerardii, yellow Indian grass, a beautiful waving grass that is when it's flowering is quite yellow in color, Sorghastrum nutans, and the switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. These three are relatively common in landscaping, and there's been some cultivars of all three of these that are sold in nurseries. These look their best in the fall, in October, and when they turn gold, red, and so on. But I really think that grasses are for winter time. And it always amazes me when I see landscapers go out and cut these all to the ground in the fall, because grasses really are plants that predominate in our landscape in winter. I mean, winter is why we grow grasses. It's when they look their best and they maintain their interests. So we never cut grasses back until May at High Plains Environmental Center. So as we're going up in elevation, I would call this the area of intermediate moisture. Another way we might look at this is on the east side of your house or the north side of your house. You will find it's cooler, and snow will remain longer in those places. And again, we're thinking in terms of microclimates that you would find in nature. Shrubs that might grow in this zone include the woods rose, which I mentioned this in terms of the riparian shrubs. You will find this in low-lying areas, but it also can move into the slightly higher and drier areas as well. And mountain ninebark, a beautiful native shrub that you see hiking in the mountains in June and July even. And this is a plant that has been introduced into cultivation and is relatively common. And the beautiful Lewis mock orange, which is showy and fragrant, blooms in the early midsummer. These are three great shrubs that will grow in this area. Maybe not bone dry, planted in gravel with no irrigation, but very drought resistant. This is a photograph at Denver Botanic Gardens. And one of the things I think is interesting about this is the use of the little blue stem grass, which turns a beautiful pinkish orange color in the fall and remains that color through the winter. So just looking at this, I mean, this photograph was probably taken in July. When I look at this photo, I think this area will also be interesting in wintertime. And so a good design there. But the grouping that we see here is the butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, prairie coneflower, Retivita columnifera, and geranium, possibly viscosissimum, but a native geranium. So these are plants, again, they're not in the saturated soil. They're not in growing on the top of a pile of gravel, but in an area with moderate moisture. Also want to mention, I don't know if I have a slide that says this further on, but I think it's very important that we don't cut back our gardens in the fall. Part of the reason is everything in Colorado just freeze dries right in place. And you see yesterday we had a little snow here. We saw little snow caps on all the dried flowers, and it creates the interesting form and reminds us of the summer garden. It also protects the plants themselves because we have more freeze-thaw cycles here than in other parts of the country. And just a little bit of foliage dried on top of this plant will protect it through the wintertime. And perhaps most importantly, often there are pollinators and insects and other wildlife existing in these dried plants. So if we're cutting the plants off before we consistently have 50-degree temperatures, which is about when you would plant like tomatoes and basil. So in mid-May, if we're cutting the plants back earlier than that, we might actually be removing insects from the garden or trampling queen bumblebees that are nesting in the ground. And so here at HBC, we clean up our gardens quite late and try and preserve the ecological function of the landscape. Here is a grass that grows in this zone, and these two plants are really something that we really commonly see in undisturbed areas here in northern Colorado or out for the Pawnee grasslands, and that is the western wheatgrass, which tends to be predominant on these clay soils. It is a short grass, and the globe mallow, Spiralcia coccinea. So this is an example of a cool season grass that grows in this hydrological zone. Flowers that we would see here include, I'm going to start at the bottom with the scarlet bugler penstemon barbatus. And I wanted to point this out as one of the most prolifically flowering penstemons. We grow this penstemon barbatus and penstemon etonii. They look very, very similar. I think etonii is called the firecracker penstemon. But penstemon etonii will bloom for like a week or two, and penstemon barbatus blooms all summer, like from June to September. It's incredible, and just an amazing plant for hummingbirds and bees of many different kinds. At the bottom is also that pink flower is Rocky Mountain beet plant, formerly called cleome, now called Paratoma cerulata. but regardless of the name, this is an annual that's extremely easy to grow. We give a lot of these seeds away here at HPC and just encourage people to literally just throw this out in your garden. Any disturbed soil, they'll pop up all over the place. And right about now, after we get a little bit of rain and snow in early spring, we just see them popping up all over. And there are so many different wildlife species that will come to this plant. Bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, all love this. On the left is the hairy golden aster, Heterotheca villosa, growing with purple prairie clover. Kind of a nice combination there that blooms at the same time in this kind of midway moist soil. And then in the upper right is the bluebells and Eriogonum, the sulfur buckwheat. Campanula rotundifolia. So now, and I think that this is one of the most interesting areas of the landscape. If we think in terms of west facing, on the west side of your house or on any building, the afternoon sun just pounds on that area. It's going to be the hottest and driest and harshest environment. People talk about the hell strips that are the concrete, between the road and the sidewalk. That would be an area where you would get that sort of intense heat and can also be extremely dry. This is a person also in my neighborhood who was really creative in creating basically a no water garden that is really interesting. And in terms of, is this native or not native? It's certainly plants that are native to the Western United States, arguably not Colorado native or Rocky Mountain native, but really cool Western plants here. And many of these are plants that are found in the Plant Select palette. And I think people have probably heard of Plant Select. It's a collaboration between the Colorado Nurserymen Association, CSU, and Denver Botanic Gardens to get plants that are suitable for our climate and our region, and some of which are native and some are not. But this bright orange plant is called the hummingbird trumpet. Formerly, it was called Jausneria. Now the name has been changed to Epilobium garrettii, but regardless of what it's called, this is a plant that thrives with very little or no water. And true to its name, it will attract hummingbirds and really showy in a hot, dry, sunny location. Next to it is the Salvia pachyphylla, the Mojave sage. This is a plant that can be really difficult to transplant. People often lose this plant in transplanting, but if it gets established in your garden, it will persist for a long time. And it does not like irrigation at all. So it's basically, once established, this is a no water plant. And Hesperalo parviflora, with the red yucca. This is a plant that is not from Colorado, but is from regions to the south. And in the back, there is the agave neomexicana, or perii, maybe agave perii, and the Mormon tea, ephedra, and perhaps the panchito or chieftain manzanita. Some of those can be, I think the Archistaphylos is not actually found in Colorado, but in Utah. But I do think the agave perii can be found in parts of southern Colorado. But Oh, also in the back there is the Apache plume, which is found in southern Colorado. And all of those are plants that can be grown entirely without water. These are photos actually that aside from the two bottom ones that I just took in the wild. And one is the prickly pear, and the blue and yellow is Delphinium guyeri. 2 years ago, we had a great bloom of these all over northern Colorado, growing there with arnica and Yucca glauca, the spike in the center, and Mentzelia, which is Mentzelia decapetala, is the 10-petaled starflower. It's a really, really cool biennial that you can throw seeds out on a gravelly, dry place, and they will just pop up. The leaves have a Velcro, really interesting kind of scratchy Velcro feel to them, and the most incredible large, showy white flower. It opens in the night, and so it will attract nighttime pollinators like the sphinx moth, and just really a cool, showy plant that requires absolutely no water, won't really tolerate water. And then the bush morning glory, which is a plant, I do wish we grew more of these here at the Environmental Center. We have one outside our front door that I like to count how many flowers are in bloom. I've seen as many as 30 flowers open at a time on this, and it really is really dominates the landscape in July. But all of these are plants that are super xeric, very, very showy, and require no water at all. I like this slide. This is at the Gardens at Spring Creek in Fort Collins. And when I look at this, it really strikes me that often the driest landscapes have the most elegant appearance or sophisticated appearance. And I think that's because each of the plants has really its own definition. If you have a landscape that is really has a lot of moisture, the plants tend to really grow really prolifically and don't have the clear definition that of all of these. But some of the things I see here in the lower left is the prickly pear with the Prairie Plains verbena. It's commonly called. It's one of the plant select plants. This looks to be a erigeron here, flea vein, and the zinnia, the prairie zinnia with the red yucca there, and in the background, Apache plume. So this is a garden that could be entirely done without water. Behind here is the mountain mahogany, the intricatus. So really cool plants and really regionally appropriate plants. This is, again, a really sophisticated and interesting looking landscape that is entirely without water. A few years ago, this landscape was created at the south end of the greenhouses, the conservatory at the Denver Botanic Garden. And I took more pictures of this than any other part of the landscape because it's fascinating how dry this is and how interesting. And these are not all native plants, but there are some native or native-ish plants, things that are at least native to Western North America. The Salvia greggii is not native to Colorado, but is native to northern Mexico and I think Arizona, perhaps New Mexico as well. This is the Chelopsis linearis here, the desert willow. And in terms of hardiness, I have this growing here in Loveland. So it is, it's native, or not native, but hardy in northern Colorado. This is an epilobium or euphorbia. Um, it's an annual that is called Snow on the Mountain. And just a little cautionary tale. I collected seed for this, and I have heard that it has milky sap that can burn your skin. And I thought I was really careful with this, but I woke up with welts on my hands the next day. So if you see this in the wild and you want to collect seed, I would be very careful about touching this plant. Other shrubs that will grow in the dry, arid landscape include the rabbit brush, Ericomeria nauseosus. This here in northern Colorado is really a dominant shrub on the high plains. This is said to be an important plant for the painted lady butterfly migration. Then they tend to follow this plant south as it's blooming. The mountain mahogany, Cercocarpus montanus, it is also locally native here. Really interesting thing about these seeds, you can tell actually when I took this photograph that it was either raining or it had recently rained or been moist, because these silvery seeds will straighten out when they're wet. And then as they dry, they will spiral like a pigtail. And you can actually watch them corkscrew themselves into the ground. So that's a adaptation that they have developed that helps to get the seeds into the ground where they can germinate. And this Chemobacteria milfolium or fern bush, it is really an amazing shrub that blooms in the hottest part. It's in the Rosaceae family, so it has an open white flower that is attractive to a lot of pollinators. So it's kind of a generalist plant in terms of pollination. Blooms in the hottest part of the year when everything else has kind of given up. Blooms in August. And it is semi-evergreen. Even in a very cold winter here in northern Colorado, it will drop its leaves for a short period of time, and the fine foliage will grow back very, very early in the spring. So there are native shrubs that, even though they're native, they're not necessarily ornamental or not necessarily well adapted for landscaping. This is a perfect landscape plant for our region, and this is something that should be used a lot more. One of the reasons that it's not, I think that landscapers have not been successful with this because they water it like conventional shrubs that like spirea and things that we're used to, and it will not tolerate that. This is a plant that will die from being overwatered. And so this is something that I say a lot about native shrubs and many native plants is I've seen more die from being watered than any other cause. Plants that are adapted to this dry landscape include the three typical warm season short grasses of the shortgrass prairie. And that is the blue grama, Bouteloua gracilis. When I show this to kids, I say grandma's eyebrows, and it makes them laugh. But then they'll always remember that's called grandma grass. On the upper right is the side oats grama, Bouteloua purpuripendula. Side oats because the seeds are arranged side to side on the stem in a really unusual pattern. And buffalo grass. Buffalo grass makes a great lawn. And one of the reasons that people don't use this a lot, or we don't see a lot of good examples of this, is people don't treat it like what it is. They mow it too much and they water it too much. And you end up having a weedy mess The best way to manage buffalo grass is to get it established and mow it once a year, just to take the old foliage off anytime between mid-April and mid-May, and then never mow it again. It will only grow to 8 inches high, which isn't too tall. If you mow it a lot, you will get a lot of weeds, and it's going to look really terrible at this time of the year because the weeds will green up and it'll just look like a weed patch. One of the objections that people have to the buffalo grass is it doesn't green up until middle to late May. And our typical turf grasses like fescue and Kentucky bluegrass will green up in late March, or late March to mid-April. So they're green or earlier, but it's worth waiting a little bit, because these lawns can be grown with no water, or if you want it to remain a little bit green. And if you look in the photograph here, it's not an emerald green grass. It's kind of a sagey green, blue green. I have found that the two don't really look well together, that it's best to have just buffalo grass with buffalo grass and not adjacent to Kentucky bluegrass, because people will ask, what's wrong with this grass? But just on its own, it's a great native short grass. I'm going to share, you will get a copy of this presentation, the recording, and we will also send a plant table that lists over 200 species of native plants, their water requirements, and the wildlife benefits associated with them. So the point of this presentation is not to give a plug to the 20 or so plants that we've mentioned, but to highlight this idea of these different groups based on the hydrological zones. And the plant table that we're going to send breaks these plants down into the hydrological zone. So if you're picturing like the front part of your house where it's dry and it's hot and sunny, and you have well-drained soil, and it's basically, desert plants, that is a group within this plant table. And plants that need a little bit of moisture, can benefit from a little bit of shade, will appreciate being on the side of your house where the snow remains longer. Those are in a group on the table. So I think that will help you to unpack this concept of how low can you go? It really depends on the type of plants and, again, how they're arranged. There's more information in this book called Suburbitat. This QR code will take you directly to the book. At this point, it's only an online electronic version. You don't have to read it on a Kindle. You can read it on your laptop, or iPad, or your phone. And there are a lot of really specific information about doing landscape as an ecological restoration, or how to grow native grass in HOA open spaces and so on. It also talks about the history of this region,